Hi, Carrie. Nice to meet you.
Good to meet you.
Put a face to the name. All right, let's get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Bibles, Badges, and Business National Conversation for the month of July. My name is Kathleen Gillen, and I'm the Assistant Vice President of Field and Constituencies at the National Immigration Forum. And I'm really excited to be with you all today. And I look forward to our discussion on the situation in Afghanistan and the ongoing evacuation efforts for our Afghan allies. So just a bit of housekeeping before we get started. We'll be hearing from each of our panelists for the first 20 to 30 minutes of our discussion, but there will be time at the end for any questions. So if you have any questions as we go, please type them in using the Q&A function, which should be at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to those as soon as we can. And I will remind everyone about questions as we go along. So as mentioned today, we'll be discussing the situation in Afghanistan, which is rapidly evolving. And specifically, we'll be talking about the Biden administration's plan to evacuate thousands of Afghan nationals who have supported American efforts in Afghanistan over the last 20 years. So to help us tackle this topic, we're joined today by three fantastic guests. First, we have Dan Costin, the Assistant Vice President of Policy and Advocacy at the National Immigration Forum. Ozzie Nelson, who was the former director of the Office of Combating Terrorism and a member of the National Security Council under President George W. Bush. Ozzie is also a veteran of the conflict in Afghanistan and a member of our Council on National Security and Immigration, which is a coalition of national security experts who believe that sound immigration policies and immigration reforms are critical to enhancing our national security. And last but not least, we have Carrie Ham, who is the Director of World Relief's Sacramento office, and who has been integral in resettling our Afghan allies, sometimes referred to as Afghan SIVs, in the Sacramento area. So thank you all for joining us today. Really looking forward to talking to each of you about this really critical issue. So before we dive in, for those on the line who aren't up to speed, I just want to give a bit of background on the situation in Afghanistan and what's happened so far. So as everyone knows, we've been at war in Afghanistan for 20 years since the 9/11 attacks. And in April, President Biden announced that his administration would withdraw all American troops from Afghanistan by September 11th, 2021. So that announcement has triggered a lot of concern. As the Taliban has been making steady gains in Afghanistan for some time now, and many predict they will return to power after American forces depart. So voices on both sides of the aisle, the right and the left, have grown increasingly concerned about our Afghan allies who will be left behind. These are largely innocent people and their families who worked in the United States or worked for the United States as interpreters, embassy staff, drivers, contractors. And these people are in serious danger as the Taliban gains strength. So many of our Afghan allies are eligible for what's called a special immigrant visa. I mentioned before, we sometimes call our Afghan allies Afghan SIVs. Special immigrant visa can be called an SIV. But there are long-standing delays and challenges in processing special immigrant visas that has yielded a really long backlog. So essentially, if you apply for an SIV, you might be waiting for years to get approval to resettle in the United States. And to be frank, our Afghan allies really don't have that time to wait right now. So an evacuation is really our best chance to safely and quickly remove this vulnerable population from a really dangerous situation. So for months, advocates from veteran spaces, defense, immigration, national security advocates like Ozzie, who's on the line from our Council on National Security and Immigration, all of these groups have really urged President Biden to swiftly devise a plan to evacuate our vulnerable Afghan partners. And also, it's not just the administration, it's Congress as well. Congress has a role to ensure that there are efficient pathways for these folks to be resettled in the U.S. And thankfully, in late June, President Biden did announce plans to relocate thousands of Afghans who have assisted the United States. But there still are a lot of questions about what comes next. So that's what we're going to delve into today. What comes next after that, after hearing that this plan is in motion. So Dan, I'd like to start with you. I'm wondering if you can share a bit about, what we know about this evacuation plan and, what questions remain or what we still need to know.
Thanks, Kathleen. Let me begin with what we know, and then I'll turn to what we don't know. So what we do know is we have a name now for the evacuation. It's called Operation Allies Refuge. We know that this evacuation will begin the last week in July. We know that the aircraft that will be used will be chartered civilian aircraft and not military aircraft. We know that the U.S. has decided to use staging site or sites, that is locations where the evacuees will be relocated while they wait to have their application process complete. We also know who are the coordinators at the Department of State. We know it's Ambassador Tracy Ann Jacobson, who will be coordinating this effort at the Department of State. And for the National Security Council, we know the coordinator for the evacuation is Russ Travers. We also have a general idea, although we don't know for sure yet, that those who are eligible are those Afghans who have applied for the SIV or the Special Immigrant Visa Program. So that's what we know. What we don't know yet is, first, we know it's going to be the last week in July, but we don't know if it will be the first day of the last week or the last day of the last week. And the sooner, in fact, the better. Better that it be today or next week than the last week in July. And this is especially true given the advances of the Taliban. What we also don't know is where the staging site or sites will be. There have been a number of possible sites or locations thrown out there. We've heard Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan. We've heard the United Arab Emirates, Qatar. We've heard possibly just US Air Force bases, could be a number of locations. And we've heard possibly Guam, which has been used in the past for evacuations such as this. What we also don't know officially is whether or not others outside of the SIV program will also be evacuated. Right now, the SIV program does have certain limitations to it, and there have been those who have been advocating for broader evacuation, and we don't know if in fact that will be the case or they were restricted solely to Afghan SIVs. And then finally, what we don't know is we don't know how many people will actually be evacuated. It's estimated that if you include both SIVs and their dependents, there's approximately about 70,000 people who would qualify for this program. However, we have seen numbers like 9,000 evacuees, and we've just recently saw a number as low as 2,500 evacuees. So we really don't know, how many are they anticipating actually evacuating.
Thanks, Dan. That's really helpful. Just a rundown of where we are. So obviously time is of the essence. I'm wondering, what are, in your opinion, some of the obstacles to completing this evacuation in a timely manner? You said late July, and we don't know exactly when, but, what is the Biden administration likely talking about right now? How are they troubleshooting?
Well, there are a number of obstacles. I guess the first one I'll mention is what we're hearing is that the evacuation will only occur out of the Kabul airport. So that's the capital of Afghanistan. They will not be evacuating people from the interior. In other words, flights won't be going into the interior to evacuate people out. And this is a major obstacle. I mean, Afghanistan, I think to most Americans, may not be aware how large it is. This is a big country. Moving from one location to another to get to the capital is going to be a problem. The other thing that we do know is that it's estimated there more than 50% of the people who qualified for the SIV program are not in Kabul. So in other words, you have greater than 50% of the evacuees who have to somehow get to Kabul. So that in itself is certainly an obstacle to the evacuation. The second thing I'll mention is simply the advances of the Taliban. This has been very significant over the last several months, weeks, and days. Just on Wednesday of this week, they took a very strategic border crossing called the Freedom Gate that's on the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan. And they presently control more than a majority of all the districts in Afghanistan and continue to add to the number of districts that are under their control. That means that anyone who's in the interior that needs to get to Kabul for the evacuation either has to risk potentially their life to get there, or simply will choose not to because of the potential risk of traveling in the interior. And then lastly, I would say time is a huge obstacle. This evacuation, from my perspective, should have been started before or simultaneously with the US military drawdown. Now, we're only weeks away from what will be the official withdrawal date, which is August 31st of this year. There's an open question as to where the Taliban will be by the end of July. In other words, will they be at the outskirts of Kabul? And if that's the case, that would also make an evacuation much more difficult. So in this particular situation, every day counts. The sooner we actually begin the evacuation, the better. Now, there are other obstacles that I haven't addressed because they're not directly related to the actual evacuation, but they're linked more to the process. And that includes restrictions and limitations of the Afghan SIV program that does not allow, for example, those under cooperative agreements or grants to qualify for the program and therefore qualify for the evacuation. We've been advocating that they actually use parole to get people to the staging starts. In other words, use parole for the evacuation. And then once you get them to a staging site, then you can look at using the SIV program or a P2 refugee designation to process them into the US. Well, let me stop there in terms of some of the obstacles or barriers.
Thanks, Dan. I know there are a lot, so it was an impressive summary. So last question for you, Dan. So we're talking a lot about the Biden administration's role in all this process. Can you share a bit about the role that Congress has to play here?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, in an evacuation of this nature, the responsibility falls to the administration. So, and ultimately directly to the president. But Congress does have a role to play, and that role includes advocating with the president on the importance of a timely evacuation, and also they have a responsibility to clear any and all potential barriers to such an evacuation. Historically, evacuations of this nature have had broad bipartisan support, and that's the case here as well. There have been real congressional champions on both sides of the aisle in this effort to get the evacuation up and running, both also on the Senate side and on the House side. And just for example, on the House side, there are a good number of bipartisan offices that have been involved in a working group that's titled Honoring Our Promises Working Group. In addition, there have been numerous letters to the president and to various departments like the Department of State, Department of Defense, and others who are involved directly in this issue. And there's been also a large number of bills introduced to try and address any barriers or obstacles within the Afghan SIV program. So for example, there have been bills introduced to increase the number of Afghan SIVs that would be visas that would be available to individuals. There are bills to waiver certain things like the in-country medical exam, and bills to reduce certain paperwork requirements while not impacting the integrity of the program at large. For example, the HOPE Act, which really addresses the medical issue or the medical exam issue, passed the House just recently before the recent July 4th recess. And once the House is back in session next week, we're anticipating that another act, the Allies Act, which would increase the number of available visas, will probably also be given a vote by the House. Now, depending on how many Afghans are actually evacuated, Congress will need to continue to play a role in advocating for Afghan SIVs and others after the evacuation and after the complete withdrawal of the US military from Afghanistan.
Thanks, Dan. So helpful. So Ozzy, I'd like to bring you in here. So as Dan shared, there's certainly a sense of urgency from the Biden administration to really clarify the details of this evacuation and to get our allies out in a timely manner. And there's also a sense of urgency on Congress to, pass some of these bills that Dan mentioned that would allot additional visas or maybe expedite, some of the bottlenecks in processing for our allies. So as a veteran of the war in Afghanistan and a national security leader, you have firsthand knowledge of, the role that many of our allies have played for the United States and also what's at stake if we don't get this right. So I'm wondering if we could start, if you don't mind sharing some of your personal perspective on, why it's so important that we actually do this and evacuate our partners on the ground in Afghanistan.
Yeah, thank you, Kathleen. I appreciate that. One of the first things we have to identify is the fact that, we have been in Afghanistan for 20 years. We are now looking at the sons and daughters of individuals that we served with now being able to help the United States as well and working in that country with the United States. It's the full spectrum of people and service has helped us there. Everything from very, very sensitive military intelligence operations. We had Afghan nationals embedded with us to very routine support functions like working in the dining facilities, manning, outlying checkpoints. And then not just national security functions. We also had them embedded with USAID and other types of, programs such as that as well. And so you're looking at a very, very broad range. On the national security side, it's important to note that those individuals that were embedded with U.S. military forces and in other sensitive activities, in most cases, received extremely thorough vetting, including, sometimes even a polygraph. So you don't embed those individuals or give those individuals access to U.S. forces or even U.S. State Department officials or aid officials without having them go through a pretty rigorous vetting process.
Thanks, Ozzy. And, you mentioned it's not, we've been in Afghanistan for 20 years. There are now generations of people involved in this process. We're looking at a large number. It's, as far as who should be included, there are people that traditionally fall into the definitions of a special immigrant visa. And then there are USAID contractors who, as Dan said before, are, grant funded. They don't necessarily fall in the SIV criteria, but they are also at risk in this situation. So Ozzy, kind of looking at a bigger picture here, would just like your take on, why you think we have a moral obligation to evacuate our allies. You've mentioned this before. I'm wondering if you can share with us a bit there.
Yeah, so we know the Taliban. We know them very well, and we know what they will do, and we know what they're capable of doing. And anyone, you can make a pretty strong argument that anyone who's touched the United States or our allies that worked with us over there will be subjected to harsh retaliation. And we're already getting reports out of Afghanistan of those people that work with the United States forces being killed or their families being killed. And as we know how the Taliban operates, it's not just the individuals that worked with the U.S. It's going to be their family members, in some cases their extended family members, and they won't be treated nicely. At the same time, we do need some of those individuals. It's their choice to stay in Afghanistan and build that country and try to protect it, as a democracy from the Taliban. So it's a delicate balance. We'll have to prioritize those individuals, again, that have worked the longest with U.S. forces in the most sensitive operations are going to be at the greatest risk. But if we, could evacuate all of those people that that worked with the U.S. from a military perspective or a State Department diplomatic perspective, that would leave a population like USAID contractors that would also be at risk. So the risk is spread throughout. It's a very difficult problem, but as Dan pointed out, we've done this before. In Vietnam, we evacuated 120,000 people. We weren't even in Vietnam as long as we were in Afghanistan. So we have a more obligation to look out for those individuals. We have used Afghanistan for the last 20 years as basically an operating base, not basically as an operating base to eliminate the terrorist threat that faced the United States. And our forces have done an absolute tremendous job with our allies of eliminating that threat, driving it to a very, very low levels. And now we have an obligation to those individuals that we ask to work with us to make sure that we at least offer them a path to safety until things settle out, or a path to come and work and live in the United States. So we can't forget that obligation that we have to them from a moral perspective.
Thanks, Ozzy. I agree. And this is something I know the Council on National Security and Immigration has talked about and wrote about in a sign-on letter to the president. But there's a conversation about like the message this sends to our allies in other places and the long-term national security ramifications for future operations, future endeavors overseas. Ozzy, can you kind of delve into that, or the council's view there? Like, what's at stake beyond Afghanistan if we don't get this right?
There's three areas. One is going to be, the terrorist networks, particularly, Al Qaeda based, and we use Al Qaeda broadly to describe terrorists that fall under that rubric. They will be empowered if the United States leaves these individuals behind, and they will use it for propaganda. They will use it to empower it. And that threat that we have lost American lives, a lot of American lives, in defeating over the last 20 years, will erode. That investment will erode, and that threat could, rebuild again and threaten the United States, and because they will use this narrative as the United States as not being a strong ally and leaving these individuals, vulnerable to retribution. And so that will just inspire terrorists to continue their activities against the United States. We also can't forget that this narrative will be leveraged by, our peer competitors, if you want to call them that, the nation state actors that are competing with us globally for allies and for resources, Russia and China. And they will use that as a narrative. Don't work with the United States. They will leave you high and dry. Work with China, work with Russia, because we will take care of you. And they will use that against us as well. So that could undermine, our national security strategy writ large. And then the last thing is really from a tactical level. No matter what, every embassy and location overseas, or where we have military forces based, we rely heavily on those host nation partners and those host nation individuals to work with us, to support us in the same array of activities that do in Afghanistan, just on a much smaller scale. But we couldn't operate in those nations. We couldn't be effective in everything from aid distribution to diplomatic activities to military relations if we don't have solid relationships with those individuals in those countries that we work. And again, abandoning a group of people that have worked side by side with us for 20 years would absolutely sound the wrong message to those countries and those individuals that seek to work with the United States.
And then on a positive note, conversely, if we do get this right, if we are able to, carry out this evacuation and do everything in our capacity to support our allies, how do you think that's advantageous to the United States moving forward?
Well, I think first and foremost, it's advantageous to our veterans, veterans who have served over there, and many who have been killed or wounded or injured. Says that investment, that service that you gave our nation wasn't for naught. That we have helped the nation, we have helped individuals that want to embrace democracy and maybe are choosing for a life in the United States or outside of Afghanistan, and we helped in that way. And then from a national security perspective, again, we can demonstrate once again that, in the United States, it is the democracy, it's the model democracy, that investing in relationships, investing in international alliances, investing in other countries can, be a positive thing, and something that can make the world stronger, make the United States stronger, and continues to help us on the global landscape from everything from economic to a political spectrum.
Thanks so much, Ozzy. And just a reminder to everyone tuning in, please put any questions you might have in the Q&A function as we go, and we'll get to those at the end of our session. So we've spoken with Dan and Ozzy about the need for evacuation, the need for the Biden administration to clarify some details and specifics about their plan, and essentially what's happening overseas. So I'd like to switch gears just a little bit now. I think another area beyond the evacuation where a lot of folks are lacking information is really what happens next after. That is, once our allies are ultimately evacuated, they've gone through the processing and security clearance procedures, they're cleared to travel and resettle in the United States. How does that work? What happens next? So Carrie, I'd love to loop you in here. So you are the director at World Relief Sacramento, and your office has actually resettled a significant number of our Afghan allies who we refer to sometimes as Afghan SIVs, special immigrant visas. So I'm wondering, I know there's a lot to share. I'm wondering if you could share just a bit about the resettlement process for Afghan special immigrant visa recipients, and how this actually works. So there's a lot to share. So to start, can you just share a bit about like how long this whole process takes, from the time a person applies to when they arrive in the United States, and how we process these folks, how we make sure it's safe for them to travel to the US. Let's just start there on the processing end.
Sure. The process for refugee admissions follows the exact same process that we used for those that helped our military and other interests, the Afghan SIVs. It follows the same State Department process. And that here is approximately 90 days. And through that 90 days, that is basically finding stability. But if we can back up just a little bit, the process itself, when we've heard about the need, we've heard about the justification and our moral responsibility, and at some point there is an invitation to apply, and once that application starts, the formal refugee resettlement process starts. Now that's where you heard about the backlog, both from Dan and a little bit from Ozzy. That process can take 1 to 2 years because there's a significant portion that we'll talk about in a minute of what happens during that application process. And that's where right now, as people are in danger, the length of that process and the number of people needing to access that process is a problem. But then once the process happens and there is approval, there's a visa issued. And at that point, someone has up to 6 months to travel. The visa is good for 6 months. And people can travel to the United States. They are assigned to a resettlement agency. There are 9 in the US, scattered across cities across the US. And once they're assigned to an agency, the US 90-day process starts. At that point, it is just gaining stability and the ability to access starting in a new home, schools, and access to services, employment, housing, those type of things. That happens in 90 days. Now, we all know that integration into a new place is not going to happen in 90 days. So that 90 days is literally just for stability. And that's where the formal process stops. And the process of integration moves on. So the process itself, once someone arrives on the US soil, 90 days to get the basics.
Thanks, Carrie. So just to kind of recap, when someone applies abroad, there's a several year wait. And there's a processing period where there are background checks run by several different security agencies in the United States. And then, once that individual is cleared through all those procedures, then they're given this visa, Carrie, as you mentioned, where they can travel to the US, and then there's this 90-day period to provide stability, which, as you said, means, housing, employment if possible, enrolling kids in schools, medical appointments, all of those kind of basic things. So question for you, Carrie. I have heard a lot of folks ask, like, should I expect like Afghan SIVs to be coming to my community? How do resettlement agencies decide where these folks will be resettled?
Well, throughout the process, the SIVs are able to share their preference, and with their preference generally has to do with someone they know, whether it's a family member who has already been resettled, whether it's someone they knew from the US that they served with, that they were embedded with. And so they have a request as far as their preference. Now that is balanced with the needs of a particular location and the ability to resettle. And so it's not 100% left up to the applicant and the Afghan SIV, but they do have a strong say in that, which is why in Northern California, we have seen, through our office, over 5,000 over the last 5 years come through just our agency alone, because there is a community here. So you're seeing some communities across the US, although there are Afghan SIVs being able to resettle in many different cities.
Thanks, Carrie. So, and you mentioned a lot of times it's about, who the applicant actually knows. And, I've heard stories, and Carrie, you maybe elaborate here, of, veterans and service members actually sponsoring their interpreter when they were abroad in Afghanistan, to come to their community. And I think that really speaks to the depth of some of the bonds that our veterans and service members have with their allies in Afghanistan.
Absolutely. We've definitely seen that, both from a family member tie, but also many times whether it's a sponsor and come to my community, or certainly connection upon arrival, a deep bond between service members and arriving Afghan SIVs.
So once an SIV recipient arrives, can you share a bit about, what are some of their most common needs? When Afghan SIVs begin to arrive in the coming months, what are some of the services and needs that World Relief or other resettlement agencies observe that they have?
Well, as I mentioned, that first period is stability, and we talked about, we're going to start with Maslow's hierarchy. It's housing. You need some place to stay. You need a place to call home. So that's, as far as stability, that's the first thing that we are doing, is finding someplace, a safe and secure location for someone to live. And then you move up a little bit, access and understanding of our systems, and where to access food, how to access the other systems, how to get your children enrolled in schools. A basic need for any parent is their child. And so understanding school system that is very different from the school system someone has been used to, transportation, and just access to different services. So we spend the majority of those 90 days making sure that those baseline pieces are in place, and then move into a cultural understanding of what are the other things that you need to know. How does a pharmacy work in the United States versus how it worked in Afghanistan? So some of those things are what we try to pack into those 90 days. But I want to emphasize, 90 days is not enough as you're drinking from a fire hose of everything that one needs to know to live into a new country, because what we really believe is that to fully integrate, you feel like you belong. And so what we work on is putting people on a path to belong. And I want to say that whether or not many times, as Ozzy mentioned, we have been in Afghanistan for 20 years. The country of Afghanistan has been at war for around 45 to 50 years. And so there is a high level of trauma and long-term living in fear. And, you know, it's PTSD. And so there are other services that need to be accessed as people begin to live, thrive, and belong in the United States. And so agencies like World Relief try to not only follow those services, but connect to other services to help people succeed here in the US.
Thanks, Carrie. That's helpful. I know I've heard from a lot of folks just some, confusion or in just being unaware of how the process works and how resettlement agencies actually help. So that's really helpful. So we have about 10 minutes left together. So I want to take time to answer a few questions. So one question here pertains to women and girls in Afghanistan and how they kind of fit into this equation. So all three of you have insights here that I think are important, but I'm just going to pose the general question of, how is this evacuation plan taking into account the threat for women and girls who have made advances over the last 20 years in Afghanistan? Are they going to be given some sort of priority, or how are they factored into this equation? I don't know who wants to start here. Dan, go ahead.
All right. Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really important consideration, and one that we have been giving a lot of thought to, and others have been advocating strongly around. I know, for example, the Bush Center has been strongly advocating on behalf of women and children in Afghanistan. And I think this is especially true in light of the Taliban and their teachings around women and children and their roles, especially in regards to things like education. Beyond sixth grade education is really prohibited by the Taliban. So women who have been actively engaged or been part of some of these programs like USAID programs that are attempting to advance the well-being of children and women are certainly going to become targets. I don't think there's any question about this, that they will become targets of the Taliban as they continue to gain control of Afghanistan and the districts. So I think that they definitely should be a prioritized group of individuals as we look at expanding. One of the issues that I did raise is, how do we actually expand eligibility? And I think this is a question that we do not have answers to yet. The SIV program in itself is restrictive. It's even restrictive for those who have worked on behalf of the US in areas like cooperative agreements and grants, or there are those who worked, for example, for US NGOs that may receive funding, again, from the US government to do some of these programs. As Ozzy pointed out, we've been there 20 years, right? We have extensive programming in that country, and these individuals currently don't qualify. So we definitely need to find ways to expand eligibility so that they would.
Ozzy, did you want to weigh in?
Yeah, and I just would add that, the one area where I would argue we've made the biggest progress from a non-security perspective has been the rights of women and children in Afghanistan. That has changed significantly and in such a positive way. And that is one of the first things the Taliban is going to undo, because it's an antithesis to everything that they believe as an organization. And so I agree with Dan that they're absolutely, it's a significant threat to those individuals.
Thanks, Ozzy. And Carrie, I mean, you've dealt directly with a lot of women and girls coming out of Afghanistan. It's totally fine if you don't have anything to add from what Dan and Ozzy shared, but I want to give you the opportunity to respond.
I definitely affirm what both Dan and Ozzy have said, and we have seen even here the ability to help women and young girls gain that confidence, and seen the difference of the gains that have happened in Afghanistan, and just the confidence and the ability to do things on their own. So I would affirm that is part of our moral responsibility, is to take care of those that we have empowered to ensure that continues.
Agree. Thank you. So we have time, I think, for one or two more questions. So because we're nearly at the end of our hour here. So This is a question for, folks at home who are interested or engaged in this issue and wondering what they can do to help. So Dan, question for you really, from an advocacy perspective, what can people at home do to really press the administration and Congress for a swift, effective evacuation for these vulnerable people?
Yeah, I'd strongly encourage people. I think sometimes people question how effective this is, but I think it's extremely effective. Contact your senators and your district representatives. And here are three things you can tell them. Number one, say to them, let's put this evacuation into operation today. In other words, let's not wait till the end of July. The sooner we get it going, the more likely it is that we're going to be able to evacuate more people. So the sooner the better. So that's the first thing. The second one is encourage them to support legislation that's already being introduced that makes available more SIV visas and that removes current barriers to this program. We know there's a huge backlog. It's estimated to be 18,000. There's a reason why there's a backlog. There's got to be some issue in terms of processing these things that is causing it. Let's remove those barriers. Let's address that. Is it more personnel? Is it certain aspects of the program that could be eliminated, like this medical exams that we talked about earlier, or other things that would help expedite this process? So support those legislations. And then thirdly, it gets back to this issue about women and children. Let's expand those who are eligible beyond what the current SIV program allows. I mean, again, we talked about cooperative agreement, we talked about grants, we talked about, here's another example. Spouses of individuals who have applied that, their spouse has been murdered because they didn't get out in time. But we have now spouses left there with their children that don't qualify technically for the program because they're dependent on their spouse to kind of be the primary applicant, and they're no longer there to be that applicant. They don't qualify. I mean, this makes, no sense. And therefore, it's something that needs to be changed. It needs to be, clearly stated that anyone who's a spouse of somebody who was an SIV applicant but was murdered, and their children, their dependent children, should be eligible for this program.
Thanks, Dan. I love the 3 clear steps. That's very helpful for me. And, I think last question we have time for here, in the same vein, for folks at home who are, eager to help these, our Afghan allies once they arrive. Carrie, you accurately said it's like drinking from a fire hose, and a lot of these individuals are coming with pre-existing trauma and years of living in fear, and they, might need a lot of support as they're, integrating and hopefully being welcomed into their new communities. So Carrie, what do you think folks at home can do to help welcome these Afghan SIVs?
So Kathleen, one of the things that when we survey the people that are coming and ask them, what do you need? What's the one thing that you would like to have? And many times we're expecting different services. And very consistently, we get, I would like to have an American friend. And also I want to say that I am on this call today because I started as a volunteer. And my first volunteer assignment was picking up a family from Afghanistan of 7 at the airport. And the father had been embedded with our US forces. And I remember saying to him, could you translate for your family, welcome to the United States? And seeing a family of 7 after a 40-hour flight from Kabul to Sacramento, California, and just seeing the smiles on their faces was the first reason that I began to step forward. Since then, I had other volunteer roles, and now I'm the director of World Relief Sacramento. So I would say to people, find the agency in your area. There's 9 agencies, 8 others besides World Relief, and there are offices all over the US. Find them and absolutely do what Dan is talking about in advocating for more people to come. But when they come, jump in any number of ways. In that 90 days, of gaining stability or past that with English classes and helping people with, resumes and doing mock interviews as they get on a career path. But jump in there and be that American friend.
Thanks, Carrie. So we are right at 12:30, and that is all the time we have for today. And really hope you enjoyed our discussion. I know I learned a lot. Dan, Ozzy, and Carrie, thank you so much for your time and your insights. And I hope everyone has a great weekend. Bye-bye.